Hello and welcome to the Beyond the Game podcast with me, Matthew O'Dell. On today's episode, we have Anna Zigic. Anna's an athlete and women's health advocate who is passionate about raising the profile of women's sport. As part of the crew there she rode the Atlantic, breaking the British record and becoming the first woman from Serbia and Slovenia to row an ocean. Since, she is featured in Vogue and has named Changemaker of the Year by Myoovi. So, welcome to the podcast, Anna. It's great to have you on.
Thanks for having me. This is super exciting.
You're more than welcome. So let's just jump in with the first questions. In your own words, how would you describe the power of sport and what it means to you?
I think for me personally, it really ties into why we did our row, and we think that sport is such an amazing platform for change and for advocacy. I'm a true believer that sport is something that's designed to unite. I mean, the ancient Olympics was quite literally the point of it, right? So I'm really passionate about having sport as a community and giving people the skills and things they need to learn in life to be able to, achieve really anything they want. You can really get that all in the foundation from sport. For me, sport is so powerful and it's a fantastic platform to raise awareness, to make change, to gather communities. And yeah, we rode so that we could inspire girls everywhere to stay involved in sport.
Perfect. So now just before we jump into this amazing story about rowing the Atlantic, I just really wanted to hone in a little bit more about your sporting journey and the role that sports has played in your life.
Yeah. So for me, sport's always been a really big part of my life simply because my grandfather is an Olympian. And to this day, at almost 90 years old, he can outswim me. He's one of the fittest people alive. So growing up, sport and fitness was a huge element in my life. Growing up, I had an older brother, and being immigrants in the UK, we moved here when I was 3. I wanted to do everything he did. I just wanted to tag along with his group. So sport was always something I was interested in. And for the longest time, I didn't really know that there was a difference between him and I in sport until we got a little bit older and we were in the same basketball club, and, the boys wouldn't pass me the ball. And then when they would be punished for any reason, then he'd make the boys do press ups, but he wouldn't make the girls do press ups. And I remember thinking, like, well, why shouldn't I do press ups? Maybe it would have done me good to do more press ups in my life. But yeah, and it wasn't until I started getting older and then segregated sport became a thing where the boys went off to do rugby and the girls went off to do netball. And I grew up playing basketball in a mixed team, and I was like, I don't really understand this. So I ended up finding rowing, which I really didn't enjoy at first, but I really got into it because what I really liked about it was actually that it was the guys and the girls trained together. We all went down to the boat club. Okay, we were in different boats, but we did all our land training together, and I just really enjoyed that element of it and kind of really found my group of people there. And I'm quite lucky to find that sport because as much as I love sport, I have terrible hand-eye coordination, and I kept breaking fingers trying to play basketball and American football. So yeah, that's kind of how I ended up getting into it. And then sport is something that got taken away from me a few times because of my endometriosis, especially before it was diagnosed. I had so much pain, and it kind of started showing up originally as what was thought was a sports injury. That was honestly a really challenging period, and getting back to it after my first surgery was such a breakthrough moment for me. And I realized, like, it's something that I'll always need in whatever form it looks like. I just really need that kind of routine, the structure, the discipline, but also the community that comes from a team sport.
You touched on it there briefly on endometriosis, but for people that don't know what that is, could you just give a bit of an explanation of what it is, how it impacted your life?
Yeah. So endometriosis, the research about it changes every single day. The reality is that very little is actually truly known about it. It was originally thought to be solely a menstrual disorder, but in fact now they've realized that it's actually something a little bit different. But essentially it's where you have cells that are similar but not the same as the cells that form in the lining of uterus during menstruation, and they kind of end up in other parts of your body. I mean, it can truly be anywhere inside your body, and it causes adhesions and scar tissue. And for me, what happened was one of my organs was essentially getting glued to a ligament. And I had a lot of pulling in my hip from that. So I thought it was a sports injury there because it got to the point that it was physically painful to stand on my leg. But on top of that, I had all the other symptoms that come from it, like painful periods, chronic fatigue. It really affects your mood, obviously being in pain a lot, digestive issues, things like that. So it's a condition that's thought to affect 1 in 10 women. But also, on average, it takes 8 years to diagnose in the UK alone. So you're in pain for a really long time. You don't know why, and it's very hard to get diagnosed and treated. Because the only way to, I think, formally diagnose it still is to do laparoscopic surgery, which is obviously somewhat invasive. But yeah, what's really kind of frustrating is it's because of the nature of the condition being somewhat connected to menstruation, or at least that's what it used to be thought of. It was for the longest time a very taboo subject. And to be honest, it frustrates me that it still is. I spoke in a school recently and I asked the group of kids, it was 100 kids, 50-50 split of girls and boys. And I said, like, does anyone know what this is? And not a single person could put their hand up. And it is frustrating because there's so many people who will be living with the condition but might not know have the tools to try and get a diagnosis because they don't have the information and it's not talked about enough. So part of what I really wanted to use the road for was a platform to talk about it, because it's awareness that's going to get results and hopefully bring down that 8-year waiting period to get a diagnosis and treatment.
An 8-year waiting period for something that's so common, 1 in 10 women. And it also said there was as common in women in the UK as diabetes, which is crazy to think that that has an 8-year kind of diagnosis window. And yeah, we really don't know a lot about it. So using sport as a vehicle to raise awareness is definitely a really, really impactful way to hopefully help to reduce that that gap.
Yeah, I hope so. I hope we prompted some conversations where people would have asked, like, oh, what is that? And do a bit of their own research. And it might help them or it might help someone they know. You never know.
Moving on to There She Rose and your rowing journey. So how did this all come about?
So obviously I've been rowing for quite a while, so I've known about the race for a long time, but it was always kind of on my mind. But because of my chronic health concerns, I never thought that an endurance challenge was something I could do. I hate to say it because like the whole point of our message was that anyone can do anything really, but I had lots of insecurity, especially after years of having been out of sport because of my conditions and things like that. So I didn't think it was for me, but I was always so curious. And one day I was, literally on LinkedIn, and my skipper, Vicky, who I didn't know at the time, had posted that she was looking for a crew. And it just so happened that someone had just moved from her agency to the agency I was at and liked it. I was working from home, like in the very room that we're filming now. I just filled in the application without really thinking about it. I saw that she'd put in her LinkedIn post that she wanted to do it for women's sport. She was very clear about who she was looking for and what she wanted. And I just thought, like, for the first time, I thought, this is something I can do. So I filled out the application, nervously waited for her to get in touch. We had 2 kind of almost like first dates. I remember being so nervous because I really wanted it. And yeah, I got selected to be in the crew. I was the only rower in the crew. Vicky herself is an Iron woman and ultramarathon runner. And then we spent the next year finalizing the crew.
So you went through quite a lengthy application process. You interviewed over 100 people to join the crew. What are the main things that you're looking for someone to take on this challenge with?
I think it's so dependent. In our fleet, of the 37 boats that finished in our year, everyone has a very different race. Every year is different, every campaign is different. So it's so contingent on what you're trying to achieve as a crew. Vicky had a very high ambition of we wanted to race. Vicky set out a contract before you joined, and you signed it, basically signing that you are ready to give everything, absolutely all. And the reason for that is because the nature of what we wanted to achieve wasn't something that you could do casually. Our charter was to have the fastest crossing that we could whilst remaining safe and staying friends. But within that, you have to set tiered goals because the Atlantic, the Pacific, whatever ocean you cross is so unpredictable that you set yourself up for failure. So the women's record was set in 2017 by a crew called Kung Fu Cha Cha, a Chinese women's crew of 4, and they did it in 34 days. And I mean, that was our number one ambition, to try and break that. Unfortunately, in our year, it wasn't possible. Then the second one was to win the women's class, and we raced against a crew called Salty Science the entire way. But until our year, I think they said there wasn't like a race that was that tight for that long. I mean, we were literally going in front and behind each other for about half of the crossing. It was exhausting. And then our final goal was, if we can't achieve those, we want to break 40 days. And we did break 40 days and became the fastest crew from Britain to do it. And we were really, really happy with that. And we knew that we gave it our absolute best, and we wouldn't have done anything differently probably. To have those goals, as I say, you have to be in a total alignment. We essentially signed this contract with Vicky upon starting, saying, we're signing our lives away, not just from like a health and safety perspective, but we didn't take a weekend off in the run up to the year of the race. The entire year, I think we had like 2 weekends off, and that was so that I could go get married.
Very important.
So yeah, it was really intense.
What did your partner make of that one?
Yeah, so Matt himself is a rower, so he understood. But I would say more than anything, he's now trying to convince me to do the row again with him. So very supportive, just a little bit jealous that he wasn't doing it.
What are the realities of training for something like this? You just alluded to only having 2 weekends off. It'd be great to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, it was really intense because we only had a very short campaign relatively to other crews. So if you were to go, for example, on like the World's Toughest Row website, you can actually see the crews who have publicly announced all the way up to 2027. People put in a long graft into this. Yeah, it's a lot of work. So we, to be honest, even though Vicky and I met in March of 2022, we didn't have a really a full crew until the end of that year. So we really only had a year-long campaign, which is very, very intense because there's like a lot of different facets to a campaign. It's not just the training that takes up your time, and it's part of the reason we didn't really have weekends. So the training is one element. So you've got your land training. You know, we were doing land training almost every day, either on a rowing machine, lots of 2-hour ergs on the rowing machine, lots of weights, lots of mobility to try and not get injured. But on top of that, we got our boat in April, which actually isn't that big a slot of time, because between April and September we had to do all of our training because it takes a long time for the boat to ship. So the boat gets shipped in like October. The other problem is the UK coastline is one of the worst places to row. It is so dangerous. I would say all of our trainings on the UK coastline were sketchier than the Atlantic itself. You have shipping lanes, you have tides, you have winds. Last year the weather was really bad, so there'd be so many weekends where we would go down to our boat on the south coast, or when it was in the North Sea, we moved around a lot just trying to find pockets of ocean or sea rather, or channel that we could row in that didn't have too strong wind, because in a rowing boat you can't really go out above 15 knots of wind, because at that point it becomes unsafe if you get dragged in towards land and things like that. And we actually did end up getting rescued on one of our final training sessions, which was mortifying, but a really good learning experience in how to handle an emergency. Yeah, not hastily going to be returning to the south point of the Isle of Wight anytime soon, but it was all good. So you have to do a minimum of 120 hours in your boat under race rules, and you have to do a set of courses. So yeah, you have to do 5 courses. So you have to do a radio course, navigation course, first aid, sea survival, and then they have like a specialty ocean rowing one. And then you have your 120 hours in a boat, 24 of which have to be night hours. We wanted to exceed that, so we ended up doing close to 500 hours in our boat, I believe. I think 300 of those were rowing hours, active rowing hours, and the rest of them were being on the boat in the marina, sleeping on the boat, or being on anchor. We really wanted to become really familiar with her, and understand how all the systems ran, what felt normal, what didn't feel normal. Also, part of the reason we needed a long campaign and we had to sort of chug it in, especially in those last 6 months, is we didn't have a long time to get to know each other. We were a crew of strangers, and you're rowing across the Atlantic in the most extreme conditions you can be in. It's very emotionally and physically testing. So yeah, we did a lot around team dynamics and team building, and we did a bit of work and some personality tests with the psychologist for Manchester City Football Club. And that was a really cool experience. And we found that we had quite a few overlapping personalities in the boat, and we were actually potentially missing one element. So it was really good to see that. So we did, I think they were the Spark personality tests, and we kind of saw that we were a crew of quite optimistic, headstrong people, and sometimes we could skip process. And that's actually where sometimes we ended up like tripping over ourselves. So it was really good to be aware of that pre-row. So we implemented a lot of things into our campaign and into our row to stop that from happening. For example, I don't know if you've read like James Clear's book on Atomic Habits. He talks about like the point and call method. So the point and call method is saying, you know, you basically point and announce something. So that got implemented, you know, the hyper trains in Japan, they've got the people on the platforms who make sure everyone's on the train. They say that when they would point, no, everyone's safe, train can go. The levels of like injuries and casualties massively decreased because you were taking away that human error of assumption. So we like brought that into our boat of being, I'm tying this line, and someone would have to be like, I see you tying that line. And like that stopped us from making a lot of stupid mistakes. It's little things, and forming those habits really helped us on our campaign. And then the final absolutely massive element of the campaign that you need so much time for is raising the sponsorship. I mean, it was a whole another full-time job on top of our full-time jobs. It was really, really hard graft. And it was something that we were doing up until the day we pushed off from land. Yeah, it takes a hot minute. Most people give themselves around 3 years to raise all the funds. It costs anywhere between £100,000 to £200,000 to do this row. And that's pre-charity fundraising.
So it's a very, very big investment.
Yeah, and that's what's cool about the row and what's really cool about sport, I think. And like, if I bring it back to women's sport, you might have to edit all my rambling out. But what was cool about this experience is, we did this row, we did this challenge, and everyone fixates on the 39 days we were rowing. But the reality is we all became, okay, 2 of us are sponsorship professionals anyway, but all 4 of us became sponsorship professionals, charity fundraising professionals, project managers, logistics managers, social media managers. Like, the level of growth and self-development and skills that we got just from doing this row was absolutely massive, and we can carry it forward in life. And like, it doesn't have to be something as extreme as rowing an ocean. I think just joining a team and maybe becoming like the treasurer of your team or something like that can give you so many skills that you might not otherwise get. And like, that's what's so beautiful about team sport in particular, I think.
Yeah, it's definitely kind of that iceberg analogy of everyone sees the nice glossy peak, but you don't necessarily always see all the hard work that goes in behind the scenes, especially when you're looking to raise in the region of £100 to £2,000.
It was that whole, like, literally like the duck on the water. It's like flapping under the water trying to get. God, I remember, like, I think I shouldn't say this on a podcast, but like right before our boat was due to ship, we were getting like invoices from the shippers, and we were like, we don't have the money. Like, we'll respond tomorrow. It was truly scrambling.
So it was touch and go at points, but you made it.
Yes. I think the row itself, funnily enough, as hard as it is, it almost feels easier than the campaign because all you have to do is show up and row.
So in terms of, like, it's obviously a huge physical endeavor and huge challenge to take on, but how did you prepare for the mental challenge that was ahead?
The mental challenge, we did a lot of work, I said, around team building because that's so important. I mean, you can do this row solo, but if you're doing it in a Sorry, I just need to figure out a way to shut her up. What do you want? Here. You're so loud. So yeah, before preparing mentally for this, you need to have a lot of self-motivation and self-fortitude. I think when you're doing the row, when things get really hard, it's almost you're still going to show up to your shift, because if you don't, you're taking someone else's break. There was one point where I kind of got food poisoning in the middle of the Atlantic, and I had to miss one shift. Well, I missed an hour and a half of one shift because I managed my first half an hour before I started being violently unwell. But then I'd slept it off for that rest of that shift, had my off shift. So I got like about 3 hours of unbroken sleep. But then I showed up to my next shift because otherwise Vicky or Ellie would have had to give up even more time. And I was like, well, I'm not going to do that. So even though on land, if I had food poisoning, I'd probably spend a few days in bed feeling very sorry for myself. When you're doing the crossing as a crew, like, you don't really have that choice because you just feel so awful about it. I think the people who do it solo, that has to be a whole nother level of mental prep. So when you're feeling awful, how do you get back on the oars? We did loads of kind of resilience training as well. So over the Easter, the year before our crossing, we did for charity fundraising and just a bit of a PR launch for ourselves as well. We walked 100 miles of the South Downs Way carrying a single rowing boat between us. And that was horrendous. I absolutely hated every second of it. And it was a really good opportunity to sort of, push ourselves to that point of pain and keep going. We did like a bunch of cold water swimming, which was brought on by Vicky as a gal who learned to swim in the Mediterranean Ocean like myself. That was really difficult for me. We did loads of scenario training. We would ask each other like pretty uncomfortable questions, like, what do we do if someone dies while we're rowing, like back on land? Like, that's a really intense question to ask, but it was like, do you want to know? Do you want your family? We had to agree as a crew, like, would we want to be informed? Would we want to change anything about it? Would we want to be like taken off the boat? Would we want to go back to land? Would we want to turn around? So we had, and like those answers changed over time. And like, that seems like a very intense thing to talk about, but it can happen, right? So we had to talk about, do we want to know about what's going on in the world, or do we want to stay ignorant? Can we handle that? Like, what do we need to do to protect our mental health on this row? And it was really interesting because, as I say, loads of those answers changed as we progressed, because like, we didn't really know ourselves at first and like how we personally handled adversity. You have an idea of it, but it changes over time. How we want to be treated. So I thought I would really want tough love. It really was actually the opposite. I didn't want tough love at all. Like, I was just happy for someone to be like, to have a chocolate bar, have your little cry and come back, that kind of thing. And like, that worked for me. Sometimes you just need that release of emotion. So it was a really interesting experience and a lot of work to do You and I did our masters together, especially in the leadership module that I had. We did a lot of work around like positive psychology and self-reflection. I'm sure you had that as well with Tony. But yeah, it was really interesting to be able to implement all that. And I think like every single day on the Atlantic was like a growth exercise, especially the really hard days. And you learn how much you can tolerate, like both mentally and physically. And you also learn very quickly what is worth talking about and what isn't. A bit of a rule that ocean rowers recommend to us is you tend to live in 2-hour slots. So you row for 2 hours, you rest for 2 hours. And if something has really rubbed you the wrong way, just like let it rest for 2 hours. And then if it's still bothering you, you can bring it up. And it basically never happened because you just realize like it tends to be something very not self-inflicted, but sometimes it's really easy to hear someone say something that might be completely innocuous and you get really wrapped up in your head, and a lot of it is coming from insecurity and things like that. So when you have this 2 hours to sit and think to yourself and you're like, well, it probably has nothing to do with me, this person's probably very tired and frustrated themselves. So that was a really good exercise, and you just have to learn to basically protect your mental health but also be there for everyone else in the crew.
Yeah, I had a kind of someone talking about this the other day, and they were basically saying, don't sweat the small stuff.
You can only control the controllables. And frankly, you can't control other people, right? So you can only really worry about yourself out there in terms of like what you can project and what you can do. Like you have to care for each other. But when it comes to people's tempers and moods, like you're the only one who has any control over yourself.
So during the race, when you're getting ready, you're saying goodbyes to everyone, your partner, your family, what's going through your mind at that point?
I think probably very different for everyone who's in the fleet. If you're asking me personally, I was just really like buzzing. There was, in the morning there was the emotion around, oh, I'm not going to see these people for a while. Doing this row is a really selfish thing to do. Like, admittedly, it's an amazing thing to do, and obviously we were doing it for a reason above ourselves. But when it comes to your immediate family, it is very, very selfish. We basically weren't really around for a year. We didn't really have time for the other people in our lives, and we had to set those boundaries out really early. And then it's culminated in this moment that that they're going to worry about you every single day that you're on the crossing, and you just have to have faith that they trust you, that you've done everything you can do to stay safe. Funnily enough, like my mum and my husband came out to my row, and honestly they were just like, oh, actually I don't feel worried about you at all in this moment. I just feel jealous. Like they got really wrapped up in the excitement of it. So that made my life really easy because I didn't have someone like clinging on to me refusing to let me go. But in that moment I remember just thinking, I just got really worked up. I was like, we need to have like a really clean exit. But that's what I was thinking about. And yeah, because we were racing, we really wanted to get out and sort of fly out the dock. And we definitely did do that. We had a really great start. But yeah, like it's hard to explain, to be honest. It's so much going on in your head at one time. And I think your brain doesn't fully, at least my brain didn't fully compute like what I was doing. I think your brain kind of tries to protect you. So people asked me when I was in the Atlantic, were you ever like really scared, thinking like you're literally just in the middle of the ocean? The space station is only 250 miles above us, and when you're in the middle of the ocean, you're 1,500 miles away from land. And my brain never really computed that because I think somehow I tricked myself into thinking the horizon, just over the horizon, was land. Like always, just over the horizon was land. So I never felt truly afraid, to be honest. All I remember was just wanting to row for the beginning, and then we got seasick, really seasick. All four of us got really severely seasick within about 8 hours, and that lasted about 36 to 48 hours for all of us. And
Oh no.
at that point, the first 3 days was just about survival. I mean, truly, it was, you got on the oars, you rowed between sessions with your head in the bucket, and then you would go on your off shift and you would just try and close your eyes because that was the only time you weren't feeling sick. None of us ate, and we were rowing 3 up. So normally you rowed 2 people on, 2 people off in a 4 for 2 hours. But because we wanted to like come out, we did 14 hours of rowing 3 up, which means you row for 2 hours and you only have 40 minutes off. So none of us had slept, none of us had eaten. All we were thinking about was we need to put as much distance between us and the rest of the fleet as we can. And it was literally, you go down to your like most base level of just driving your legs down and trying to row. It was kind of unhinged.
Just running on empty at that point, I imagine.
Like literally, yeah. And then the waves came in and they were massive. We had such big sea at the start of our row. It was wild. I remember watching one specific wave form, and they're going in your direction. Obviously, we row backwards, so we're facing the waves. And Vicky and I were rowing, and I was like, mate, does that just not look like Everest to you? Does that not look like a genuine mountain? I think it was like 30 feet or something. But obviously, your perception, you're in this tiny boat. And then you pitch up, basically, almost like on vertical, and then it throws you. And you're just so convinced the boat's going to not roll, but literally flip vertically over. And yeah, it's crazy. But you, after the first one, you actually kind of find it quite fun.
It's a mini roller coaster.
Yeah, quite literally. And it gives you a bit of free speed, right?
Anything to get that advantage, right?
It's wild. Like when I try and think back on the row, I'm really confused to where 39 days went. I remember the first 2 weeks really, really clearly. I remember like a little bit of a middle section when we ended up on Power Anchor. And I remember like the last 4 days, but there's somewhere in there's like 15 days just missing for me.
15 days in the pain locker, I imagine, just trying to survive and get through.
I remember before the row thinking, how does anyone do this? For, the year before us, the slowest crew was a solo that I think took like 109 days. And I remember thinking, like, what do you do? Like, how do you fill your day? Like, how do you not actually lose your mind?
Yeah, and what's fueling you through the row? Like, what are you eating? Because I imagine you're burning an extraordinary amount of calories.
Yeah, food was the hardest thing for me, to be honest with you, actually, on the road. I really, really struggled with food on the Atlantic crossing. So there is a formula for how many calories you have to take, which helps. So every crew has to take 60 calories per kilo of weight per person. So you work it out for yourself. So if you're in a crew of 4, you have to take 55 days worth of food. That's considered like the longest your crossing should ideally take. And then 11 of those have to be emergency rations. So the difference between those two is, you can get like those wet ration packs that you don't need to add water to, and then you have the dry ones. And the reason for that being an emergency is the assumption is in the emergency you don't have a functioning water maker because we desalinated our own water. So for food, in terms of how we ate, we would take like, to make our lives easier, we would make like one really big sandwich bag per day. And like that was to remove like choice, to be honest. We would switch them up, so each one would be a little bit different, but they were formed of like 2 to 3, depending on what your preferences, of these like dehydrated ration packs, and then the rest was snacks. And you could split that however you wanted to. The reality was that if you're racing, you might want to take less snacks because snacks are heavy, whereas the dehydration ration packs are really light. For me, my snacks saved my life because I really, really struggled to eat the ration packs, especially after one gave me food poisoning. I lost 10 kilos in 39 days. It was quite severe. I found eating really hard. The seasickness passed after 3 days, but just like actually having the energy and the desire to eat actually just disappeared for me. And it didn't really pick up until halfway across the row. At that point, I started eating my snacks more, and it helped, and I stopped losing weight. And if you're someone who's okay with eating high volume, you're better off than someone who's not really good at eating high volume but tends to eat richer food. But yeah, the food is the hardest part.
Yeah, it sounds like a bit of an uphill battle, I'm sure. After a few days, the ration packs probably are all tasting quite samey as well.
Well, they do. And the other thing is you're really supposed to put hot water in them, but we boiled water twice on our entire crossing. And otherwise we just like filled it with cold water, left it for a couple of hours in the sun, and then ate this cold, wet mush that gives you heartburn. It was horrendous.
Really selling it to me here.
I know. But honestly, like, if you think about it, when you're like, for example, if you're thirsty, right? You have a glass of water next to you. How long does it take you to go get that glass of water and fill it up? Like, no time at all, right? When you're in the Atlantic, you finish rowing. You've rowed for 2 hours, probably, maybe more. You then have 2 hours before you're due to be back on the oars in that time. That 2 hours, by the time you get off your rowing seat and switch with the other person, say it's been like a minute, then if you want to refill your water or have water for your food, but your water canisters are empty, say that you've drank them, you then need to turn on the water maker. The water maker you should only really run at high sun when the solar panels are getting the full heat of the sun, because it drains so much power from the boat. And you never want to be in a position where you drain your lithium batteries to the point that they go into power save mode, because then everything switches off and you have no navigation, no radio, and it's not a particularly safe place to be. So then the water maker needs to run, and it takes like an hour for it to make enough water for everyone for the day. And water makers are prone to break. So at that point, like, you've already lost like a good amount of time. You need to wipe the salt off of yourself, because you can get really severe salt sores and like exposure, basically like blisters all over you. Then you need to eat something, because you absolutely have to eat something. Maybe you want to call someone home on your sat phone. At that point, you've probably lost like an hour of time. And like, when are you meant to sleep, right? And then the other thing is, in the day, we didn't really sleep because the cabins could get up to 40 degrees Celsius. So it was not safe to go in them in the day. And on the deck, there was basically nowhere to hang out if you had 3 people rowing. So you would sit on like a couple of inches of deck, just trying to stay out of the way of the rowers. So at night, you had to be even more efficient, because you would only really be getting about 4 hours sleep every day. And that was in the night, and you really couldn't waste any of your off shift. It was really, really complicated to make sure that you could eat, drink, do everything you need to do, but also you were maximizing rest. And like, nothing about it is simple at all.
Feels like even the simple tasks become 10 times more complicated.
It makes you really grateful for it when you come back to land, just like how simple it is to get yourself a glass of water.
Yeah, just the convenience, I imagine, was probably a bit of a mind-blowing reality. And how did you deal with the kind of exposure to the sun as well? Because I imagine the fact that you're not going into the cabin means that you're on deck in the midday sun for most of the day.
Yeah, I absolutely hated the days. I really preferred rowing at night, personally. We had about 12 hours of day and 12 hours of night, which is great, because you get really tired in the night and you'd fall asleep on the oars and potentially hallucinate and lucid dream. That was always quite entertaining. But in the day, we would all go so quiet. No one would want to talk in the day. Everyone would just be trying to survive. You'd overheat massively. So you'd be wearing a hat, you'd be wearing like UV long sleeves. You'd be having to drink so much water with like electrolytes in it. Just basically doing everything you can to take care of yourself. So like, our skipper was water police, and she'd be checking how much water people drank to make sure that like we weren't going to get dehydrated, because it could happen so easily. I was sun police, to make sure people were like covering up or wearing sunscreen. Like, everyone had a role on the boat for everything, just to take care of each other. But yeah, it was awful in the day. It was such a relief when the sun would set. And like, in the nights, we tended to be a lot more lively. Like, you'd be sleepy, of course, and your body would naturally kind of just want to drift off, but we would play podcasts and like listen to music and sing and play word games, because you actually had the wherewithal to function, whereas in the day you were literally just trying to get through the day. Also, the nice thing about the night is you actually couldn't really see the waves, so you kind of just went with it a bit more, whereas in the day I found that our rowing actually was choppier, because people would like get a bit too wrapped up in what they were seeing rather than just the feel of the boat. So I think the nights were much nicer. The only downside of the night is the flying fish would come out. And that was really frustrating.
Flying fish.
Yeah, look it up. Oh my God. Flying fish are like, they can be like literally like millimeters long to like a foot long. I looked it up. They can fly like a couple 100 feet in one leap. They would jump on our boat, and they were vile. They would stink and flap about and leave the little scales everywhere. And we spent like half of our night shift would be spent trying to like throw them off the boat. Every wildlife encounter was so special, even the flying fish. As annoying as they were, they broke up the monotony of it.
What other sorts of wildlife did you end up seeing?
We saw whales a couple times, or at least 3 different species of dolphins. We got visited by birds every single day, which is really weird, getting visited by birds in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And what's cool is the closer you get to Antigua, the more tropical birds you see, and you know you're coming towards land. But one of the coolest / scariest things we saw is we had 2 encounters with a blue marlin. And like, blue marlins are the thing that every ocean rower is afraid of. They're like gigantic swordfish. Yeah. They have a habit of attacking the boats. Like, the theory is it's because they're hunting. You're your own little ecosystem, right? You're the only patch of shade in the Atlantic, so you get tuna hanging out under your boat. So the first time we saw one, we were rowing along, and we heard it. They can swim at like very fast, like faster than a car can go, basically. And we heard it come out of the water. It jumped and breached pretty much like 10 meters away from our boat, and it genuinely sounded and looked like a torpedo. And then the second time we saw one is when we had to go on power anchor. We saw something circling our boat, but we couldn't tell what it was under the water because it was moving quite slowly. So I stuck my GoPro under the boat to have a look. And while it was circling, we felt it bump the boat, but still didn't know what it was. We thought it was just like a bit of a clumsy shark. then when I went into my cabin and like looked at the video, bear in mind I had my hand under the boat. It was a marlin hunting a fish under our boat, and we actually caught it catching the fish and swimming away like on camera. But yeah, the dolphins and the whales were unreal. There's something really special about them coming to see you because they hang out, they just like chill, and they're really curious about you. And they seem to always come when we really needed them. Ellie and I were rowing, and I heard like a blowhole, but I didn't want to say anything because I wasn't sure, right? And I didn't want to like get Ellie's hopes up. And then all of a sudden we heard them singing under the boat. And as I said to Ellie, I was like, do you hear that? These pilot whales started like jumping around us, and there was like a mum and its baby, and it was really emotional and it was really special. And it just makes you think, okay, some of this is hard and some of this is awful, and I'm suffering more than I think I've ever suffered in my life. But who else gets to experience this? And like that makes it all worth it.
Yeah, I can imagine that's quite something that you'll remember for a long time. What, in terms of like other dangers that are around there, you've obviously got the kind of wildlife, huge waves. What else do you need to keep an eye out for?
So you do need to be careful about like the waves and capsizes. You have to be careful. It's things that are avoidable. We had 2 women go overboard during our crossing. And that wasn't even when we got hit by a big wave. That was just like fatigue and slipping, really. The deck is quite slippery. And there are 2 really key rules on the ocean when you're ocean rowing. And one is that your cabin doors, unless you're coming in and out of your cabin doors stay closed. The reason for that is if you happen to capsize, which happens, like it happens quite often, and your cabin doors are open, you would basically prevent your boat from self-righting, which is then obviously a massive problem. So that's the number 1 rule. And the second one is we all had harnesses on that you would clip to guidelines on the boat. Abby and Vicky, on the 2 times that either of them fell over, weren't tethered onto the boat when they fell. Like that would be it. Like they would be gone. So being clipped on was so important. That's like, it's just not worth the risk. So that's something you have to be really careful of because it doesn't take a lot for you to fall off the side of the boat. They're very tippy. There's obviously like ocean debris, like garbage in the oceans, which is really sad to see. But there was one day when we were rowing and we saw like a giant kind of almost like cage netted thing. And it was going so fast. And we thought like, if that hit us, that'd actually put a hole in our carbon fiber. So you need to have a bit of wherewithal about like debris in the ocean. You also need to be, obviously there are big storms. You just need to be careful about that. There's not really much you can do. You just row through them. Other dangers, like just taking care of yourself, not getting sick, not getting heat stroke, not getting injured. And then the other thing you need to be careful is just other ships. So you need to be quite good at communicating when a ship comes up on your system. So we had this system called an AIS system. And, there are massive ships in the Atlantic. And you kind of just have to radio them and be like, hey, do you see me? Please don't run me over. And the first time it happened, it was in the middle of the night, and there was a bit of stress, and there was a debate as to whether or not we should light one of our flares because they weren't responding to us. And your system is basically repeatedly telling you that you're on collision course, and they're moving very quickly. Luckily, they got back to us, and they were like, "Yeah, it's fine, relax. You're a massive cargo ship." And then after that, we were a bit calmer, and we got better at like being patient. Like you have to remember, sometimes these people probably fall asleep on the bridge, right? Like they're also on night watch. But we also had a really special encounter from a super yacht that was being crossed by crew only from the Canaries also to Antigua, and they actually came to visit us. And that was a really emotional, wonderful experience, actually, because we hadn't seen other faces in 25 days at that point. And it was like, wow. And yeah, it's funny. We posted it online and everyone's like, oh, I hope they threw you like some food or drink. And it's like, they're actually not allowed to because we'd get disqualified from the race if they did. So yeah, we just got to watch them be on this like luxury yacht, but it was still really nice to see them.
You were pleased with the company, but yeah, I would have appreciated some food.
They pulled out like a big speaker and played Eye of the Tiger, and it was all really actually quite sweet. We were actually in tears when they left.
Yeah, and so I guess on that point, you're in the Atlantic with 3 women that you didn't really know before. You're thousands of miles from land. When things get tough, how do you keep each other motivated?
There are days when people are very low for whatever reason. And it would be like sometimes, someone would be like, just please don't talk to me for this shift. And you would respect that. Calling home could also be a huge relief. Some people like, Abby and I actually called our loved ones more daily, whereas Ellie and Vicky called every few days, and that worked for them. Everyone has like a different thing that works for them. Vicky was really great as a skipper because there were a few points in the Atlantic where I was in like really severe pain, like really bad like flare-ups from my endometriosis, like which was a bit of a combo of like not sleeping, not eating, and I would have like it tended to happen the night you just feel very sorry for yourself, and I'd be like, oh, I feel so weak, and I feel like this, and like all my insecurities would come up, and Vicky was amazing at being like, this is exactly why you're here, and like this is the message that we need to put out, that like you can do this, and like people with conditions like this can do this, and like if it just means that you need to every half an hour in your 2-hour shift just stand up and like shake out your legs and then get back to rowing, like that's what you need to do, and that's okay. So just like really being kind to each other was really important.
And were there any really low points in the journey? Did you ever think that you weren't going to make it, or was it all very positive?
No, I don't think I would say we never felt like we weren't going to make it. There were low points for me, like with like food poisoning, like that really sucked. Like I was very unhappy. But I would say, like, as a crew, the lowest point in our journey was actually when we had to deploy our power anchor, because this is when we were still first in the women's class. We were absolutely flying. Everything was going really, really well. But we were kind of like, we were going back and forth a lot with Salty Science, but it was motivating us. But we told ourselves pre-row that we didn't want to throw out the power anchor. And I think we were kind of slightly unprepared for what it would actually look like, because I think in our heads, so just a bit of context, a power anchor, there's no anchor that's 5 kilometers deep, right? That's the bottom. So it's like this big parachute that you throw out that stops you from being dragged the wrong way. It's like a huge resistance, and you throw it into the water and like locks onto the water basically. And we had it in our heads that like if we needed to deploy a power anchor, it would be because we were in some massive storm and the waves were really big and we were under massive risk of capsize. Like that's like literally what we like envisioned. The reality was so different. Halfway across the road, the winds basically turned. The trade winds completely died down, and we all got really bad headwinds that started like rowing full force. 3 of us, we were still not even rowing forward. We were getting pushed backwards towards like the African continent, and we were like, fuck. But it was awful because we were like, we'd be texting. We had an inReach that communicates on satellite, our Garmin inReach, and we'd be texting our coach, and we'd be saying like, we're rowing as hard as we can. And he said he gave us like a range of between 2 bearings, and he was like, if you can stay between this degrees and this degrees, you're fine. The second you can't stay on that degrees, you need to throw out your power anchor. And that was really frustrating for us because actually the wind was so strong, but the sea was actually quite calm. So like visually, we were like, well, this doesn't make sense, but we were going the wrong way. And you're so tired and so sleep deprived, and your brain can't make sense of it. So you get very upset and very worked up. So we had to throw our power anchor out 3 times in 3 days. Once for 7 hours, once for 5, and the last one I think was for 2. And like it was a good opportunity to sort of like clean the boat up, clean ourselves up. We all had showers, we all had a good meal, we all had actual sleep. So it was good in that sense. But we basically watched the record slip from our hands in that moment. We knew in that moment that was over for us. It meant Salty Science actually, their positioning, they took a different route from us a little bit. They managed to stay off power anchors. Actually, we were informed that they were coming closer and closer to us. And like it is just, it's just very stressful to not be doing anything. So that was like a low point in the crew, that we were all like quite angry. And then the other really low moment was towards the end, we found it really hard to stay on course. We're not really sure what went wrong. We don't know if it was like us making human error, but like our system and what our screens were telling us, the direction we were going in, weren't totally aligning with the reality of what was happening. So like there was one night where we thought we were going perfectly, and then our coach messaged us and he was like, you've been going 25 degrees off course like for the last 4 hours, which friends. So like we started like cracking there a bit under the pressure of it, just being like, just really want to finish this row at this point, and like little things are going wrong and slowing us down. And then losing first place, like fantastic team to lose to, absolutely brilliant group of women, and I think they made us row faster by constantly trying to race against them. But of course, like it was gutting to watch that loss go. So that was really intense. Yeah, those are the low moments. But at no point did we ever feel like can't do this. Just like annoyed that we weren't going faster.
So looking back on the experience, what are your favorite memories?
Honestly, I think one of my favorite memories of it is just getting that opportunity to be so far out of my comfort zone and work with people who I would have never met, and honestly do so many things I would have never done. But yeah, but for the actual row itself, just like those really sweet moments of seeing wildlife or seeing a comet streak across the sky. And I mean like a comet, not a shooting star. That was unreal. And, and even little things like trading sweets with the person rowing and like things like that. It was really, really lovely. And I would say one of the things I actually miss is the simplicity of it all. I think coming back to land has actually been slightly overwhelming. I miss kind of it's weird to say, like the whole experience is just really amazing, even the hard bits.
That's really nice to hear. And how did it compare to your expectations going into the row?
I think because the expectations from Vicky, she's a fantastic skipper, was so clear from the outset. It was exactly what I expected. There are bits that you can't predict, like it's an unpredictable thing to do, but it was kind of, I think Vicky said it on the podium, like it was everything I thought it would be and more. And the impact has been really amazing as well. Like if I think broader than the row, we did this to inspire women everywhere to stay involved in sport, and the impact has been absolutely massive. And I actually didn't think it would get that big. I don't know why I didn't, but it just blew up. And we get messages from people from all over saying that they've picked up sport again, or that they're going to pick up swimming in their older age, or they're like little girls are captaining their boys football team, and that they've been inspired by us. And I got to go home to Serbia and speak in the media about women's sport and endometriosis, which is still very kind of behind and being talked about there. Like it's been absolutely beyond my wildest expectations, like the row itself, but also the way our campaign absolutely blew up, and like the impact it's had has been incredible.
Yeah, it's nice to hear that both kind of your experience were really positive, but also, yeah, everything that you've set out to achieve is really, really actually taking place.
Yeah, it's really awesome. It's been so special. And the fact that it's still going is 6 months later is really cool.
What was it like when you saw sight of land for the first time?
It was funny actually, because as I say, you row backwards, right? So you're not facing it. And Ellie came out of her stern cabin, and when you come out of the stern cabin, you're facing the way you're traveling. And she was like, "Oh, I think I see land." I think we were 20-ish miles out at this point. It was quite a clear day. And like I kind of like, it's not that I didn't believe her, but I was like, nah, like it has to be a cloud. And she was like, no, I swear. She got really worked up about it. But that was really cool because you row for these 2-hour shifts, and then every time you turn around it's even closer, and it's actually slightly overwhelming. Like you can really smell like the stone and the soil like long before you get to it. And then you like hear the waves crashing, and then you see green. You've like not seen the color green in so long. And then you see the trees and actually the individual leaves, and you're just like, it's kind of like a sensory overload. And then the finish line is so overwhelming. So, so overwhelming. It's like you don't even know what to do with yourself. It's absolutely wild because you pull into the harbor and you cross the line and your family's there, and like this the whole flares thing, and then there's all these super yachts that start like blasting their horns for you, and you're just like I haven't had this much like sensory overload in such a long time. And then you do your whole podium thing, and then you have your first meal just like on this lawn in front of everyone, and you're like watched like a little animal in a zoo, and everyone's like looking at you while you eat your chicken burger. It's so weird, but really, really cool. And it's like obviously loads of tears and hugging and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and obviously such an amazing effort. You finished the row in 39 days, 12 hours, and 25 minutes,
Yeah.
breaking the British record by 23 hours, which was set the previous year. How did it feel to kind of know that you'd achieved that as well?
We actually didn't know straight away that we'd broken the British record, to be honest with you. And we also didn't know that if we would qualify for it technically, because even though I've lived here since I was 3, but our coach was like, "You need to look into this." And then it got confirmed a few days later, and we were like, "Oh, that's really cool." So it actually took a minute to set in. But yeah, in the moment, you kind of, you're just so excited to be on the finish line that in the moment you don't really register like, I guess, how big a deal it is. And then a few days later, that was really cool to find out. But I was also really proud. I knew I was the first woman from Serbia or Slovenia to do it. And that was really, really special, because I would love to see more women from both countries doing big adventure sports like this. I mean, Slovenians love adventure sport anyway, so I'm surprised I'm the first, but it was really cool to see. But yeah, once it sank in what we'd achieved, and that was really cool. It's kind of like a basic thing to say, but as I say, you struggle to sink in, because all you do is show up and do what you do and what you've trained for. And the Atlantic, don't get me wrong, we worked so hard to earn what we earned, but at the end of the day, you're so at the mercy of everything that happens to you out there, that you just have to kind of be grateful to the sea for letting you do your thing, really. So that was really, it's something I'm really grateful to have. I do have my heart set on trying to go for a world record one day. We'll see. Like I say, it's one of those things that you can have all the ambition in the world, but what happens on the day happens on the day, right? Or across the month. No, I'm not ruling it out. I'm being worked on to do another one by my husband.
Exciting. And then, so you went from spending 40 days on a boat in the middle of the Atlantic. How do you kind of go about returning to normal after that?
It's weird. Returning to normal is a really weird experience. So first of all, you take a really long minute to get your land legs back. Like physically, like you can split it up between like physical, mental, and just then societal. Like the immediate thing is you step onto this podium, which is on solid land, and you're convinced you're still on the boat. You're like falling around everywhere. And it's really funny when you're in Antigua, you know exactly who's done the row. Like you can tell who the rowers are, because we all have horrific tan lines. The men have the wildest beards. But also everyone is hobbling around, because you lose like all of the muscle in your legs. You completely atrophy, because when you're on the boat, you don't really stand. You kind of crawl around and like hold on. So you atrophy massively. I think like one rower told me that they found out they'd like lost like 37 or 38% of their calf muscles. So you actually like, you can't really walk up a hill for a while. Walking is really difficult. You've got like you've got really stiff, you get like claw hand from holding onto the oars, so you get really stiff hands. Your first night sleeping in a comfortable bed, your like back completely seizes up. Everyone had really bad backs. So you've got like, you have to work through these physical deficits and sort of like getting back into like a normal eating routine. Like our skipper Vicky took forever to get back into normal sleeping routine. You like takes you a minute to stop dreaming about the ocean, like, and having like really vivid dreams of it. So like, you have to get through this like physical thing first, and then you have the mental element. So for a lot of people, and definitely happened to me, you have like this huge like blues crash, where you're like, wow, like nothing really compares. And you can see why a lot of people end up becoming repeaters and doing the row again. And then you like go back to normal life, and it's actually really hard. So I started a new job, which for me is an absolute dream job, and I'm so grateful to have it. But I totally underestimated like what it would be like to go back into a new job, having actually not been in an office for like 4 months at this point. Because I stopped working at the end of November and started my new job in March. And like timings and project management and things, I was like, whoa, I don't know how to do any of this anymore. But my office was so lovely and so accommodating. But it takes you, I'd say, it's now been, what, we finished on the 21st of January. It's the 29th of June today. And it's like, I honestly still, is it till the 29th? I still feel like I'm adjusting, to be honest. Like, yeah, it's weird. And I found myself thinking about it more and more and almost missing the simplicity of it all.
Perfect. And yeah, I guess throughout this process, then what did you kind of learn about yourself, and how has it changed your perspective on life?
I learned that you need so much less than what you think you need. In like terms of like material possessions, honestly. Like it's quite a simple life out there, and I actually really enjoyed it. And I learned that so much. I always really struggled with like the concept of like mindfulness and slowing down, to be honest. I don't know, I've had this conversation with someone recently. It's like, okay, we went through our masters together, but I found like when we're in the school system, we like get funneled, do your GCSEs, pick your A levels, go to uni, do a master's, you need to go get a job, you need to fight for a promotion. And all of those things are so worthy and so valid. And like part of the reason we did this row is, I think over 90% of women in C-suite positions did sport. When you do sport, you're an ambitious person, and that's all really well and good. but it's wild how early we burn out these days, and it's because we're always being told to chase the next thing. And obviously doing this row is a massive thing. I'm not trying to say like it's a casual thing we did, but part of what we learned in it is like slowing down and really enjoying the moment, and like understanding that you don't have to be constantly chasing something, which I know sounds slightly counterintuitive, but it is something I really pulled from it. And, I think about, would I do another challenge like this? And I stop and think like, oh, but is that going to be damaging to my career if I take another chunk of time out? But the reality is like, there is always a workaround. And like part of this row is like, the one thing that I really learned about it is if you have the grit and determination, but also the community around you, like really, anything is achievable. When we tell people we did this row, the first thing most people would say is like, oh, it could never be me. And it's like, well, actually, that's so untrue. And doing this row taught me, especially with my chronic illnesses and my insecurities, frankly, if we're talking mentally and physically, that I always thought this wasn't something I could do, is that's just so not true. And you're capable of so much more than you think you are. At the end of the day, we were 4 women, all with full-time jobs, who got together to do the training, raise the funds, like none of it got handed to us. And we're very privileged to be in a position that we even thought we could do something like this. Don't get me wrong, I recognize that we had a head start there already compared to, I'm sure, a lot of people who feel that they wouldn't feel that way, and don't have the setup to do it. And, some people won't have families that are supportive. So I'm not trying to say that this is an easy thing to do. By absolutely no means is it not. But if you have a community around you who can support you, and you have that kind of self-belief, I think you can make things work in a lot of cases. I'm not saying that's absolute, but that's something I learned, that not only in terms of physical, but in terms of like mental and resilience, grit, you're capable of so much more than you think you are. And that's what we really want to tell people and put the message out there and say. And it's not just for the job of the person alone, it's for the people around them to support them as well. And kind of so many of the barriers that we see in girls sport, if I bring it back to that, like if we all stepped up to challenge them, and we're seeing it now more and more, like really being paved the way by the Lionesses in the UK, is like it can be tackled and it can be challenged. We just have to stop accepting what we believe to be true and actually looking forward. And that's something that the row kind of taught me on a really personal level going through.
Perfect. And if you could go back and give yourself one piece of advice before you started, what do you think it would be?
Gosh, that's a loaded question. I don't really know, to be honest. I think one thing that it would be to take myself less seriously. Very much so. Think and worry less what people think of you and like people's judgments, and just like have a bit more fun with it. Because I remember getting really stressed at points. And don't get me wrong, it's a stressful thing to do, especially with like the fundraising. But I think having a bit more fun with it would be definitely something that I would tell myself to do, and like maybe worry a little bit less.
So I've just got some questions that I ask all guests that come on the podcast that'd be great to ask you. And the first one is, who is someone in your life that inspires you, either past or present?
I think personally in my life, it has to be my mum, which I think I want to be clear that I'm not just being a cliche and saying that, because sometimes it frustrates me, especially when you have, maybe I shouldn't say this on a podcast, but when I ask male athletes to name a woman who inspires them, they'll almost always say their mum. Because like, do you not know more women? Maybe that's a controversial thing to say. But for me, it really is, because my mum is like an absolute unit of a human being, to be honest. And I said at the beginning of this podcast that I didn't really realize that I had barriers by being a woman, like inherently, until I was a bit older. And that's because she really, really kind of, I wouldn't even say she shielded me from those issues. She just bulldozed them for me. And I was given every opportunity to do everything I ever wanted, and told that I could do it regardless of, the fact that I was a girl. And, she essentially raised me as a single mum, because my parents divorced when I was quite young. She sacrificed everything for us so that we can have every opportunity to do things like I'm doing now, like rowing an ocean. And she was my number one supporter rowing across the ocean, and like gathered all my support in Serbia for it. Really my mum, because she taught me more than anything that like if you want something enough, you could probably knock the earth off its axis if you wanted to, kind of thing. And I would have to say my grandfather as well, for instilling kind of like discipline and sport into my life as well. So those two have had a huge impact on my life personally.
Perfect. And what's one piece of advice that you would like to share with us?
I think a piece of advice that the row really taught me is take the time to understand people a bit better and like honestly do your research. I think it's really easy to make assumptions, and it's like if I was talking to people about, what more needs to be done for women's sport, for example, sometimes it's really easy based on your life experiences and your bias not to really understand the challenges that are still being faced by some people. So, we see the Lionesses doing really well, and like it might be easy to assume that like the answer is there, but at a grassroots level, you have girls maybe not going to football because they still don't feel safe walking in a dark common at night in the middle of the winter. Like it's not so simple from like a safety perspective. So I would really just encourage, and I think that comes to, like all the way down to chronic illness. I remember not being able to show up to rowing training because I'd be in so much pain pre-diagnosis, and like I would have coaches who weren't sympathetic. What I learned and I would advise people is you can never really assume someone's story. So just, having that empathy, having that patience and doing your research and trying to learn, I think will make such a difference in everyone's lives.
Perfect. Thank you. And then what's next for you?
What's next for me? As I said, I've just started my new role at my agency, so really throwing myself into that. But the reality is there's probably another row on the horizon. Not ready to commit to anything yet. I'm just trying to get my feet back on the ground at the moment and actually have my honeymoon and really enjoy my work at the moment. But I think there is a calling to the ocean to return one day.
Sounds like you'll be back doing it again one day, I'm sure.
Yeah, probably.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for coming on. It's been a pleasure to have you.
No, it's been so lovely speaking with you, and honestly, it's been so long since our masters. So
I know. It's amazing how time flies.
I know it's actually slightly terrifying.